Field, welcome to the program.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So, the Turkish central bank released its last inflation report of the year this past week. The bank kept its interim targets for 2025, 26, and 27 unchanged at 24, 16, and 9% respectively. The messages in the Turkish central bank's inflation report, especially the fact that no inflation targets were revised except for this year's forecast range, were perceived as hawkish by the Turkish markets. We saw a decline of more than 3% in the banking index that day. How do you evaluate this report?
So reading this report, what struck me is that the Turkish central bank, despite the fact that it had to revise the window for this year a bit upwards on inflation, it feels vindicated. It feels that it sees the signs that disinflation, though slowing, is continuing, and it feels justified that it slightly loosened its rates policy a few weeks ago, although this received a lot of criticism from Western commentators and commentators outside Turkey. Inside Turkey, I think there was a lot of pressure to start reducing rates, which are extremely high. But this is what my main takeaway is from the report, that they feel that they're on the right course and that they were not wrong or premature in their slight loosening of the rate. And then for next year and the year after that, yes, it does seem very ambitious to go down to 16 and then to 9. So we'll have to wait and see. I think that the strong rates policy is helping, certainly. And then maybe on the risk side for inflation, you have the currency's volatility, and you also have global volatilities which can hold up markets that Turkey is dependent on for imports.
So you also mentioned Turkey is dealing with high inflation. Do you find the central bank's monetary policy for fighting inflation successful?
We'll have to wait and see. I mean, the target is extremely ambitious, given that we're still above 30% inflation annually. This is something that the current leadership of the central bank in Turkey inherited. So I wouldn't criticize them for the legacy that they inherited. And they do seem to be perceived as credible and committed to the policy. So this is where I would pay them some compliments. We'll have to see for the results. We don't have them yet. But where I can say nice things about them is that they do seem very committed to bringing down inflation above other goals, be they short-term growth and prosperity. Bringing down inflation appears to be their main goal, and they sound very committed to it. At the Atlantic Council, we interviewed Fatih Karahan only recently when he was in DC for the annual meetings. And obviously, I wanted him to speak on many issues, including digital currency. He had interesting answers on that, of course. But the real commitment and the real focus of the interview was on bringing down inflation. And so that's, as everyone knows who follows your channel, showing a commitment to bringing down inflation above other goals and communicating that to the markets is very important. And I think they're doing a good job at that, but the challenge is huge.
Yes, so as you mentioned, you met and interviewed Fatih Karahan during his visit to Washington for the IMF and World Bank annual meetings. And I want to know, what were your main impressions of him as a central banker and policymaker?
I think he was a very interesting policymaker to interview because he spent so much time in the United States. So he knows how to communicate to an American audience, and even shared with us how the transition for him from serving in the United States, someone who worked for a large US corporation and also for the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, moving to Turkey, which is his native country, of course, but somewhere where he hadn't worked as much professionally as an economist. He mentioned that some of these challenges, but I think it was very interesting to me that a lot of Turks attended this meeting, and then I think we got a lot of viewership also online. My guess would be that this was mainly for Turkish viewers. So he knows who he's communicating to. He does quite a good job of speaking to both and sounding convincing to both. But he always has to make sure that the Turkish audience remembers that he's committed to bringing down inflation. And sometimes I would ask him questions about a few other matters, and he often would bring his answer back to the commitment to bring down inflation, which is his job after all.
So do you think Turkey's monetary policy is receiving sufficient support from fiscal policy? Do you think the current economic program applied in Turkey is the right one for fighting inflation?
Well, this is a bit more of a controversial question, I think, for an independent central banker. I think the perception that this central banker is independent and not influenced by politics is also crucial, so that markets actually think that the destination of lower inflation is credible. But as you rightly mentioned, fiscal policy is a really important part of the mix, and fiscal policy is more political. My understanding is that there's some good coordination and a good relationship between Finance Minister Shimshek and the governor of the central bank, Mr. Karahan. So that's good news. And the governor of the central bank is capable of mentioning when fiscal policy is making bringing down inflation more difficult. He speaks of it, and he will also sometimes repeat the government's lines on things that are necessary. The communication, at least, is that they are coordinated, and he has no doubts that fiscal policy will also remain committed to this sort of normalization of Turkish fiscal and monetary policy. So my perception from a distance is that there isn't much of a conflict there, and they both have the same goals.
And let's talk about foreign investment a little bit. If you were to summarize it in a few words, how would you describe foreign investors' current perception of Turkey?
I think it's improving, but they are looking very closely at the behavior of all institutions. I think this is a really important lesson for Turkey, that it's an attractive market, but that it cannot rely on its geographical position, which is very strategic and a big advantage. But this is not enough to make sure that investors continue to see Turkey as a good destination. They also look at the health of institutions, political institutions, and monetary institutions. I think their perception on the monetary institution right now is pretty good, but there are questions about the rest of the institutions, which still do provide a bit of a cooling effect. That being said, there's a lot Turkey can do, I believe, to make sure trade and investment are a source of prosperity for the future. What's unfortunate about the previous policy before the normalization is that you did have an increase in revenue for households because you had a loose monetary policy and a very generous fiscal policy. And so the overall balance of the economy was less good. You had current account balances, and overall this was a bad result, which now the government and the central bank is trying to normalize. And I don't necessarily see the full results so far. I think investors still have questions about institutions.
What steps do you think Turkey should take in order to attract more foreign investors? What are the most important criteria here?
I think predictability, transparency, a sense that the politics are not, there's less political risk than there was previously. Those would be helpful. And then on the central bank side, a commitment to bringing down inflation. An openness on the government side to partnerships with firms that are willing to bring in technology, provided that they have a transparent institutional framework. Those would all be very positive things to do. I'm talking about partnerships a lot because my perception is that for Turkish manufacturing to be competitive for the next 20, 30 years, it needs to adopt the latest best practices. And while Turkish firms are very innovative and often take risks and pull it off, I think that to accelerate fast and bring in the latest technologies, you need Turkish conglomerates and Turkish firms to be in partnerships with global firms. And you need those global firms, when they invest in Turkey, to do some technology sharing. That, I think, is the best way to accelerate.
And what kind of risks should Turkey be careful about as we move into 2026?
I mean, there's always geopolitical risk in Turkey's neighborhood, and I think the economic leadership does a good job of reminding international investors of the fact that there are risks present, but also opportunities. But geopolitical risk, I'd say, would be the main one. And then I think, should there be a more volatility on international financial markets and the so-called AI bubble were it to burst, then you would see a retrenchment of Western investors. You'd see them you'd see a flight to security. And unfortunately, I think Turkey would be a sort of collateral effect of that. So those would be the risks for next year.
Mr. Lichfield, thank you so much for joining our program.
Thank you for having me.